Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marian Ruth Marcos, and today my topic is all about the history and cultural background of Chinese literature. The history of Chinese literature. Chinese literature is a vast subject that spans thousands of years. One of the interesting things about Chinese literature is that much of the serious literature was composed using a formal written language that is called a classical Chinese. Chinese literary works include fiction, philosophical and religious works, poetry, and scientific writings. The dynastic eras frame the history of Chinese literature and are examined one by one. So the first dynasty was the Shang dynasty, the development of Chinese writing. The first dynasty for which there is historical record and archaeological evidence is the Shang dynasty. It was a small empire in northern central China. No documents from that country survive, but there are archaeological finds and hieroglyphic writing on bronze wares and oracle bones. The hieroglyphic writing system later evolved into ideographic and partly phonetic Chinese characters. Zhou Dynasty, the basic philosophical and religious literature. The Zhou dynasty was contemporaneous with the Shang dynasty, and then they conquered the Shang dynasty. Their dynasty lasted for about 800 years. The great literary works of philosophy and religion that became the basis for Chinese religious and social beliefs stem from what is called the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. Taoism, Confucian literature, and other prominent religious and philosophical schools are all emerged during these two periods. So the major literary achievements of the Confucian classics, early Taoist writings, and other important prose works originated in the late Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period of the Zhou dynasty era. These literary works deeply shaped Chinese philosophy and religion. The Qin dynasty, literary disaster and legalism. At the end of the Zhou dynasty era that is called the Warring State period of the surviving few big states in the land, the Qin dynasty became the most powerful. An early form of Buddhism was also established in China at that time, but their temples and literature were destroyed, and even less is known about them. The emperor wanted to reduce the 100 schools of thought to one that he approved. He ordered the destruction of most books all over the empire. He even killed many Confucian philosophers and teachers. He allowed books on scientific subjects like medicine or agriculture to survive. So the book burning and burial of scholars was a literary disaster. The Qin emperor favored a philosophical school that was called legalism. This philosophy, of course, justified the strong control of the emperor and maintained that everyone should obey him. It is thought that Lisi thought that human nature was naturally selfish and that a strong emperor government with strict laws was needed for social order. Han Dynasty, scientific and historical text. At the beginning of the era, Confucianism was revived. Confucian texts were written or rewritten and republished. Confucianism was mixed with the legalism philosophy of Lisi. The resulting ideology was the official ideology of the Han Dynasty and influenced political thinking afterwards. The era's major contributions were historical texts and scientific works. So the Han Dynasty era was one of the two main hotspot eras of scientific and technical advance, but printing wasn't available for wide publication of the information. Kai Lun of the imperial court is said to be the first person in the world to create writing paper, and this was important for written communication at the end of the empire. Dynasty, the early woodblock printing and poetry. The Tang Dynasty had a big empire that benefited from the trade with the West along the Silk Road. battled with the Tibetan Empire and experienced the growing influence of organized Buddhist religions. This era's main contribution to Chinese literature was in poetry of Du Fu, Li Bai, and many other poets. Du Fu and Li Bai are often thought of as Chinese greatest poets. Li Bai was one of the greatest romantic poets of ancient China. He wrote at least 1,000 poems on a variety of subjects from political matters to natural scenery, while Du Fu also wrote more than 1,000 poems. He is thought as one of the greatest realist poets of China. His poems reflect the hard realities of war, dying people living next to rich rulers, and primitive rural life. Song Dynasty, the early woodblock printing, travel literature, poetry, scientific texts, and the Neo-Confucian classics. It was weaker than the Tang Dynasty, but the imperial government officials made remarkable scientific and technical advances. The era is divided into two eras called the Northern Song and the Southern Song eras. One of the era's technological accomplishments was the invention of movable type about the third of the second millennia during the Northern Song period. This helped to spread knowledge since printed material could be published more quickly and cheaply. The Confucian classics were important in China's history because from the Song Dynasty onwards, they were the texts people needed to know in order to pass an examination for the bureaucracy of China. These Confucian classics were the five classics that were thought to have been penned by Confucius and the four books that were thought to contain Confucius-related material but were compiled during the Southern Song era. The five classic books include the Book of Changes, the Classic of Poetry, the Record of Right that was recreation of the original Classic of Rites of Confucius that was lost in the King Book Purge, the Classic of History, and the Spring and Autumn Annals that was mainly a historical record of Confucius' native state of Lu, while the four books include the Analects of Confucius, Mencius, the Doctrine of the Mean, and the Great Learning. Yuan Dynasty, drama and great fictional novels. In China, the Mongols established the very rich Yuan Dynasty. In their camps, the Mongols were entertained by shadow puppet plays in which a lamp cast the shadows of little figurines and puppets on a screen or sheet. In the Yuan Dynasty, puppet drama continued to entertain the rich dynastic courts in vernacular language. Dramatic operatic theaters with human actors speaking in vernacular language was a favorite form of entertainment as well, and some of China's best dramatic scripts were written then. Also, two of the four novels that are generally considered China's best literary classics were written in vernacular language then. Ming Dynasty novels. The Chinese rebelled against the Mongols, and the Ming Dynasty era began about 1368. The Mongols and the Ming government still sometimes fought. It is interesting that the book that is one of the four great classics called Journey to the West about the monk going to India was written during the time of isolation. Maybe the thought of the travel to the lands in the West was appealing then. Novels were the era's main contribution. It is an interesting book that is one of the four great classics called Journey to the West about the monk going to India. It was written during the time of isolation. The Journey to the West is based on the historical journey of a Buddhist to India during the Tang era to learn Buddhist teaching and bring back scriptures and information. Qing Dynasty novels and pre-modern literature. The Manchus invaded the Ming Empire from the north and established the last dynasty called the Qing Dynasty. The Manchus were not Chinese, but they retained the Neo-Confucian governing system of the Song and Ming eras. The Qing dynasty came under increasing attack from both internal rebellions and foreign countries. In the 19th century, foreign literature in the West became better known. In the middle of this era, the last China for great classic novels was written called Dream of the Red Chamber, and near to the end of the era, modernistic literature developed. The modern era or westernized literature. Yu Sen led a revolution that marked the end of the Chinese dynasties in which a clan rulers an empire. Of course, the big change of Chinese society that happened with the change of government led to a change in literature. It became westernized, and the classical language wasn't used. The national government wanted women to have more of an equal status in society, and women writers and scholars were taken more seriously. There was a lot politically oriented literature printed. Scholars had access to foreign literature, and many students could studied abroad. Under the national government, there was some freedom of expression, and lots of views and styles in literature were popular. China became under attack from Japan after the communist victory. Only literature approved by the government was allowed. Chinese culture. China is one of the four ancient civilizations along Babylon, India, and Egypt according to the Chinese scholar Liang Qiao. It boasts a vast and varied geographic expanse, 3,600 years of written history, as well as rich and profound culture. Chinese culture is diverse and unique, yet harmoniously blended, and an invaluable asset to the world. China's heritage. China's national heritage is both tangible and intangible, with natural wonders and historic sites, as well as ethnic songs and festivals included. China's festivals. China has several traditional festivals that are celebrated all over the country in different ways. An example of Chinese festivals are Sisters' Mills Festival. It is an important festival of the Miao minority people in China. It's a celebration of love and spring. It was regarded as the oldest Valentine's Day of China. This traditional festival falls on the 50th day of the third month in the lunar calendar, and the celebration usually lasts for 3 days. Chinese festival also have Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year, also known as Lunar New Year or Spring Festival, is China's most important festival. It is time for families to be together and a week for an official public holiday. China have also symbols. The example of symbols are Chinese dragons, national symbols, giant pandas, and the Great Wall of China. China's regional food types. China can be divided into several regions with distinct styles of cooking. The ingredients used are based on the natural and agricultural products of each region. On the northern China food, salty, simple, less vegetables, with wheat as staple of food. Food using wheat as its main ingredient, such as noodles and dumpling, is prevalent there. While the western China food, the food there are hearty halal food. The central China food, spicy with a lot of seasonings. Eastern China food, sweet and light. And the southern minority food, sour, and many minorities eat chilies every day. China have also arts and craft. The example of arts and craft are Chinese silk, ancient Chinese furniture, Chinese lanterns, and Chinese kites. China have also performing arts. The example of performing arts in China are Chinese folk dance, Chinese acrobatics, Chinese puppet plays, and Chinese musical instruments. That's all for my report. Thank you for listening and God bless.